The sky above Germany was a pale sheet of winter steel, streaked with long white trails from hundreds of American bombers pushing east in perfect formation. Inside each B-17 Flying Fortress, frost clung to oxygen masks, engines roared in mechanical unison, and young airmen stared into the blinding glare ahead. At 25,000 feet, the world was reduced to metal, ice, and distant flashes of flak. German interceptors scrambled below, black specks rising like hornets from frozen airfields. Their radios crackled with familiar confidence. Same bombers, same route, same slow targets. Fighter cannons were armed, attack runs plotted. For months, American bomb groups had come this way, heavy, exposed, and alone. In one of the lead B-17s, a tail gunner scanned the horizon. He had learned to count the seconds between sighting enemy fighters and impact. Today, something felt different. He could see the enemy closing in, but he wasn't afraid, because this time, the bombers weren't alone. Just ahead, cutting through the sky with impossible speed, a new silhouette appeared, sleek, fast, and predatory. But this moment was not how the war in the air began. Long before that frigid day over Germany, the United States Army Air Forces entered the European conflict with an ambitious idea that a war could be won not only by armies on the ground, but by high-altitude precision bombing. American air doctrine, shaped in the interwar years by thinkers like General Billy Mitchell and the Air Corps Tactical School, argued that destroying key industrial targets would cripple the enemy's ability to fight. Unlike the British Royal Air Force, which favored night bombing for survival, the United States believed in daylight raids, accurate, surgical strikes delivered in tight formations. To execute this doctrine, America produced two heavy bombers in immense numbers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. The B-17, with its thick armor, multiple gun stations, and reputation for returning home with wings shredded and engines failing, became a symbol of resilience. Each aircraft bristled with up to 13 50-caliber machine guns, manned by 10 crewmen trained to fight off interceptors while holding formation. On paper, it seemed unstoppable. When the 8th Air Force began its campaign in Europe in 1942 and early 1943, morale was high. Training films and briefings repeated a confident phrase, "The Flying Fortress can take care of itself." The idea was simple. If the bombers flew in large enough numbers, overlapping their defensive fire, they could form a wall of lead that no enemy fighter would dare penetrate. U.S. commanders believed that bomber self-defense made long-range escorts unnecessary. Across the Channel, Luftwaffe pilots viewed these first American arrivals with a mix of curiosity and sarcasm. The Germans had grown accustomed to the RAF's night bombers, slower and vulnerable, but the American formations were something else. Disciplined, bright in the daylight, flying high and tight, trusting in doctrine. Still, the Luftwaffe was confident. Their fighter force, equipped with agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s and later the more heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190s, had years of combat experience over France, Britain, and Russia. They had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, Yaks. They were not afraid of lumbering bombers. The first major raids seemed to validate both sides' expectations. In late 1942, American bombers struck targets in France and the Low Countries. German interceptors attacked, but losses were moderate. Bomber crews returned with damage but celebrated their survival. In mess halls across English air bases, the phrase "tough old bird" became common whenever a battered B-17 landed on two engines. Confidence soared. The American public read newspaper headlines praising the Flying Fortress. Politicians pointed to the bombers as proof of American engineering power. Even some Luftwaffe officers admitted privately that the design was impressive. Yet beneath the surface of early success lay a dangerous assumption that the bomber alone could dominate the sky. As 1943 began, mission depth increased. Raids were ordered deeper into occupied Europe, toward factories in Germany itself, targets like Bremen, Kassel, and Schweinfurt. These were not short-range strikes over coastal territory. These were long-exposed flights into the heart of enemy defenses. Escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, though powerful, simply did not have the fuel capacity to follow the bombers all the way to target and back. Somewhere near the Belgian border, they would bank away and turn home. Bomber crews began to call that moment The turn. The moment their escorts vanished into the western sky was when the real war began. Isolated, engines droning, guns scanning the horizon for the inevitable black dots rising to meet them. It was in these moments, over the gray expanse of the German heartland, that the Luftwaffe stopped observing and began hunting, and then the true test of America's daylight bombing doctrine began. The first deep strike missions revealed the brutal reality that American doctrine had not anticipated. Without fighter cover, the bomber formations became predictable, exposed targets. German radar detected their approach long before they crossed into hostile airspace. Luftwaffe command would scramble interceptor wings from multiple airfields, arranging them not for a single strike, but for waves of continuous attacks timed to coincide with the bomber's most vulnerable stretches. From the ground, it looked almost rhythmic. First, the contrails of American bombers appeared, long white lines gliding high above. Then rising from below and behind, the darker, thinner trails of German fighters climbing to meet them. The Luftwaffe's tactics were coldly methodical. Pilots were trained to break bomber formations by concentrating fire on the lead elements, severing the formation's cohesion. Once bombers drifted out of position, they were circled and finished off like wounded prey. Bomber gunners fought back with determination, filling the sky with tracer fire. Yet against experienced German pilots flying fast, closing head-on passes, firepower was no guarantee of survival. Luftwaffe ace tactics became devastatingly effective, slashing through formations from 12 o'clock high, firing cannon bursts at close range, then diving away before turret guns could track them. German pilots described the bombers as tough but blind, strong in defense when engaged at the flanks, but vulnerable in direct frontal approach where their guns struggled to depress in time. Then came the missions that shook American command to the core. In August 1943, the 8th Air Force launched one of its most ambitious raids, a double strike at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, key centers for ball-bearing and aircraft production. More than 370 B-17s took off. They crossed the German frontier, believing their numbers would be enough. German interceptors rose to meet them in force. For hours, the bombers flew under relentless attack. Gaps appeared in their formations. Smoke trails marked the fall of damaged aircraft. Crews across English airfields waited anxiously as the returning bombers began to appear over the horizon, but far fewer than expected. Of the 376 bombers that departed, 60 were destroyed and over 550 airmen were lost or captured in a single day. Many of the aircraft that returned were riddled with holes, limping home with engines burning or landing gear stuck. The mission was considered a tactical success. The factories were hit, but strategically, it was a failure. Loss rates of nearly 16% per mission were unsustainable. Commanders knew it. Aircrew knew it. Even the Germans, who celebrated the raid as a major victory, recognized something deeper. American industrial power would keep sending bombers. But without a change, those bombers would continue to fall in staggering numbers. Reports from bomber crew debriefings began to carry a new tone. The phrase, "Where were the fighters?" appeared more and more. Pilots and gunners quietly spoke of the moment their escorts vanished, the moment hope seemed to fade, replaced by a kind of cold resignation. They would face the rest of the journey alone. At high command briefings in England, charts told the story clearly. Bomber losses spiked dramatically once escort fighters turned back. No matter how disciplined their formations or how many guns they carried, the bombers could not fight a war of attrition against veteran Luftwaffe interceptors without protection. And so the question shifted. No longer did commanders ask whether bombers could defend themselves. The question became something far more urgent. How do we keep the fighters with them and all the way to the target and back? That question would lead to one of the most significant shifts in air warfare strategy of the entire war, and to the arrival of a new aircraft that would change everything in the skies over Europe. The American daylight bombing doctrine looked formidable on paper. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried multiple turret positions, nose, tail, waist, dorsal, ventral, creating a cage of overlapping fire. The concept of combat box formations was designed around this idea. Bomber squadrons would fly staggered, layered groups where every aircraft's field of fire covered the blind spot of another. At altitude, These formations looked like vast steel fortresses moving across the sky, and at first glance they appeared unbreakable. But German Fighter Command did not see fortresses. They saw patterns. They saw speed, altitude, and formation timing. They studied the angles of turret depression, the blind arcs where guns could not swivel quickly enough, and the seconds it took for a gunner to shift focus. They noted that 50 caliber firepower, while lethal in sustained bursts, was only effective when fired upon targets approaching from predictable angles. So they changed the angles. Rather than attacking from the sides where waist gunners had clear lines of fire, German interceptor units adopted head-on approaches. Coming in at closing speeds that exceeded 600 miles per hour combined, Bf-109s and FW-190s would fire their 20mm and 30mm cannons in a short, violent window before rolling left or right and diving away. At that speed, the bomber's nose turrets had almost no time to react. A single cannon shell could shatter a cockpit or ignite a fuel tank. Bomber crews later described these attacks with a mix of awe and horror. In training films, they were taught to expect flank attacks, fighters spiraling in from above or below. But nothing prepared them for the sight of German fighters coming straight at them, guns blazing, passing so close they could see the enemy pilot's goggles for a split second before the aircraft vanished in a blur. Formation discipline was meant to counter fear. Every bomber crew was trained to maintain position no matter what happened to the aircraft beside them. But this discipline came at a cost. Damaged bombers, engines stuttering, could not fall back or evade without risking the entire formation's integrity. Those who broke formation often died alone. Those who stayed became part of a wall of predictable targets, a wall that German pilots learned to punch through again and again. Meanwhile, the U.S. escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, faced their own tactical limitations. The P-47 was rugged and heavily armed, but it had limited range. With external drop tanks, it could extend deeper into Europe, but not nearly far enough to follow the bombers to strategic targets like Berlin or Leipzig. The P-38, with twin engines and long wings, had better range but struggled in high-altitude combat against German fighters optimized for performance in those conditions. Pilots reported compressibility issues in steep dives and engine failures in cold temperatures at altitude. As a result, American escorts could only protect bombers for a fraction of the mission. Once fuel levels reached critical return thresholds, fighter squadrons were ordered to turn back. Pilots often described the emotional weight of that moment, looking down through their canopies at bomber formations continuing eastward, knowing those crews would soon face the Luftwaffe alone. German ground observers began to note this moment too. Reports timed the appearance and disappearance of American escort fighters with accuracy. Luftwaffe radio operators documented it in simple terms. At 10:42 hours, enemy fighters turned west. Bombers continue alone. That brief line became a signal. Airfields scrambled fighters. German pilots took off, climbed, and aligned their approach routes, knowing the bombers were now exposed. In many ways, the battle for the skies over Europe during this phase was not about firepower or bravery. Both sides had plenty of that. It was about endurance, the endurance of fuel, endurance of aircraft range, endurance of doctrine. And for all its firepower and engineering brilliance, the American bomber strategy had a time limit. The Luftwaffe knew it. The bomber crews felt it. Every man aboard a B-17 understood one thing with chilling clarity. Survival depended not on the guns they carried, but on whether someone would still be flying beside them when the enemy arrived. Before every mission, bomber crews gathered in briefing rooms across airfields in England. The maps were always the same. A red line cutting eastward across the English Channel, over occupied territory, straight into the industrial heart of Germany. Commanders spoke in calm voices, pointing to enemy flak zones and expected fighter interception points. But there was always a moment, quiet and unspoken, that every man in the room felt. The point marked where escort fighters would turn back. Veteran airmen referred to it with a mix of dark humor and cold truth. The Lonely Mile. It was the stretch of sky where the bombers would be beyond help, where no American P-47 or P-38 could follow. Crews joked about it in mess halls, but in the air when that moment arrived and the silver shapes of their escorts banked away, the humor vanished. Waist gunners watched the departing fighters disappear into the bright western sky. And even amid the thunder of engines, there was a hush, a silence filled only by the knowledge that the real fight had not yet begun. For the German pilots waiting below, this moment was equally significant, but for entirely different reasons. Luftwaffe command briefings were delivered with confidence. Pilots were told that American heavy bombers were large, slow, and predictable. They were instructed to exploit fear, to make the bomber crews feel hunted. Many German pilots believed their role was not just to shoot down aircraft, but to break morale, and they nearly succeeded. Survivor accounts from bomber crews frequently mention the terrifying predictability of German attacks. The first wave came shortly after escorts turned back. Then another and another. It felt relentless, mechanical. Some crews reported seeing the same squadron markings on German fighters, circling back for repeated passes. The enemy did not flee after firing. They returned again and again, until fuel or ammunition forced them to disengage. Inside the aircraft, fear had a smell and cordite from fired guns. Hydraulic fluid from damaged lines burnt insulation. Crew spoke of numbness, then a strange calm that settled when survival seemed unlikely. Yet amid the relentless tension, there were also moments of unshakable resolve. B-17 gunners continued firing until their barrels glowed red. When oxygen lines froze, men went unconscious, revived by crewmates slapping their faces through frost-lined masks. One tail gunner would later write, "You stopped thinking about living or dying. You just focused on keeping the formation tight. If one bomber fell out, it was like watching a friend drift away into the dark." To the German pilots, the sight of bomber crews staying in formation despite catastrophic damage was both remarkable and puzzling. Many Luftwaffe reports express a grudging respect for American discipline, but respect did not soften their mission. They knew that every bomber that reached its target meant destroyed factories, lost fuel production, damaged infrastructure. For Germany's war machine, each bomber that slipped through was a blow. Still, German airmen held on to confidence as long as the sky favored them. As long as the bombers were alone, as long as the escorts disappeared beyond the horizon, the Luftwaffe believed the skies over Germany belonged to them. That belief would not last. Because even as bomber crews endured the lonely mile and German pilots executed perfected interception tactics, engineers, strategists, and pilots back in Allied command centers were preparing something new. Something faster. Something with the range to follow the bombers not just part way, but all the way. Something that would shatter the psychological balance of the air war. And when it arrived, it would not simply escort the bombers, it would hunt the hunters. In late 1943, whispers began spreading across the airfields of the 8th Air Force. Mechanics spoke of a new fighter, something faster than anything the Luftwaffe had in the air. Pilots heard rumors that this machine could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Most dismissed it as talk. Every new aircraft was rumored to be the one that would change everything. But inside a hangar at RAF Debden, a new silhouette stood beneath the frost-covered roof. It was sleek, low-slung, with long, elegant wings and a streamlined fuselage that looked more like a racing aircraft than a war machine. Stenciled on its side was a simple designation, P-51B Mustang. Originally designed as a British request fighter, the early Mustang models had seen limited use. It wasn't until engineers fitted the aircraft with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a power plant known for its high-altitude performance, that the Mustang transformed. Suddenly, this fighter could climb faster, fly higher, and maintain power where other American escorts struggled. And then came the feature that would change strategic air warfare forever: external drop tanks. These sleek fuel tanks, mounted under the wings, extended the aircraft's operational range to over 1,600 miles. It meant one thing: the Mustangs could go the distance. On December, escort missions were launched with the new P-51Bs in limited numbers. Bomber crews saw them form up alongside them over the channel. At first, the crews didn't believe what they were seeing. They expected the P-51s to break away early, like the Thunderbolts and Lightnings before them. But as the mission pushed deeper, crossing into the dreaded interception corridors over Germany, the Mustangs did not turn back. A radio transmission crackled between bomber and fighter channels, a moment recorded in later accounts. Red leader to bomber group. Stay tight. We're with you all the way. In that brief moment, something shifted in the hearts of bomber crews. They watched the Mustangs dart ahead, taking high cover positions above the formation. These fighters didn't fly in tight protective circles like previous escorts. Instead, they pushed out, aggressive, predatory, scanning for enemy fighters before they could strike. Far below, Luftwaffe radar stations picked up the incoming formations just as they had hundreds of times before. Interceptor units were scrambled, climbing to meet the bombers. German pilots tightened their gloves, confident in familiar tactics. But as they approached firing range, something was wrong. The bombers were no longer alone. Mustangs flying ahead of the formation dove with lethal precision. They didn't wait to respond, and they initiated the hunt. American pilots, finally unleashed from escort limitation tactics, began engaging German fighters before they could coordinate an attack run. Squadron records note the confusion in German radio traffic. One pilot reportedly shouted, "Achtung, neue Jäger. Sie greifen uns an. Attention. New fighters! They are attacking us." For the first time, the daylight bombing campaign felt different. The Mustangs weren't just defenders, and they were interceptors in their own right, turning the hunter into the hunted. Bombers' crews watched with disbelief as P-51s chased Bf-109s in long, spiraling dives. From that day forward, German pilots would describe a new fear: the long-winged American fighter that stayed in the sun, waiting. The war in the air had reached its turning point, and it was only beginning to reveal its full consequences. By early 1944, the Mustang was no longer a rumor. It was a presence. Luftwaffe pilots, once confident in their hit-and-run tactics, began noticing something unsettling in their engagements. The P-51s did not break away. They did not disengage after a single burst. They pursued relentlessly, even into German-controlled airspace. This was new. This was terrifying. Over the radio, bomber crews began repeating a phrase that spread from formation to formation like a mantra. "If you see the Mustangs, you're going home." The first deep strike. Berlin, March 4, 1944. The 8th Air Force initiated Mission 250, the first American bombing raid deep into the heart of the Reich, Berlin. The Germans believed Berlin was untouchable by daylight. They prepared their fighters for the usual pattern: wait for the escorts to turn back, then tear the bomber formations apart. As the bombers crossed deep into German territory, radar stations picked up the familiar formation. Luftwaffe command ordered their interceptors to take altitude and prepare to strike. The clock was ticking. They expected the escorts to turn back at any moment. But when the German fighters formed their attack run, they saw something that sent a shockwave through the Luftwaffe command network. Silver shapes still flying high above the bombers. Escort fighters still present over Berlin. Repeat, escorts have reached Berlin. That transmission, recorded in German intercept logs, marked one of the most significant psychological blows of the air war. The Reich capital, once considered beyond the reach of American fighter cover, was now within the Mustangs' killing range. Unleashed from defense, the Free Hunt Order. Then came the order that changed everything. General James Doolittle, now in charge of the 8th Air Force, issued a directive that broke with every previous escort doctrine. Fighters are no longer tied to the bombers. Engage and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air, wherever you find it. No longer shackled to tight escort formations, P-51 pilots now had one mission: seek out and annihilate German fighters before they could even threaten the bombers. This was called Freie Jagd. Free hunt. The Mustangs flew ahead of the bomber streams, roving in packs, waiting in the high sun. German squadrons climbing to intercept suddenly found themselves ambushed before they could form attack patterns. Luftwaffe veterans described it as being hunted inside our own airspace. The Luftwaffe's breaking point between January and April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more fighter pilots than in the entire previous year combined. Many were not just shot down. They were chased, forced into low-altitude dogfights where fuel was scarce and escape routes limited. Mustang squadrons began targeting German airfields during landing patterns, striking at the Luftwaffe when it was most vulnerable. German ground crews described the sound of P-51 engines overhead as the sound of a closing trap. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland would later admit. The Mustang was the best Allied fighter of the war. It could escort the bombers very deep, too deep. It broke our defense. The shift in the sky from that moment on, the air war over Europe was no longer about bombing accuracy or escort timing. It was about air domination. And the Mustangs made that domination possible. Bombers, once shredded in isolated corridors of friendly fire, now flew with confidence. They carved through German airspace not as prey, but as part of a new aerial machine, a combined force where the Mustangs flew not as bodyguards, but as predators. One bomber gunner wrote in his diary after returning from Berlin. We saw them dive ahead of us, not defensive, but hunting. It felt like we weren't just surviving anymore, we were winning. The Luftwaffe, strangled by fuel shortages, overwhelmed by attrition, and constantly harassed by Mustang patrols, began to withdraw from daylight engagements. The skies, once a battleground of parity, had become American territory. By April 1944, the pattern was set, and it was devastating. Every time the 8th Air Force launched a major bombing raid, the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept. But instead of finding exposed bomber streams as before, they found waiting Mustangs. The skies above Germany had become a layered trap. P-51s flew 3 levels of interception. High cover, Mustang squadrons above bomber altitude, diving into German formations as they climbed. Close escort, fighters weaving between bomber boxes, ready to break off and attack any incoming threat. Free hunters, independent units detached entirely from bomber formations, sweeping German airspace, stalking airfields, and ambushing reinforcements. This new aggressive doctrine was more than just an escort mission, it was air superiority turned into an offensive weapon. Big week. The Luftwaffe bleeds in. February 1944, the U.S. launched Operation Argument. Known by bomber crews as Big Week. The objective, destroy the German aircraft industry and force the Luftwaffe into a fight it could not afford. For 6 straight days, American bombers hit factories in Leipzig, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Gotha, and Augsburg. Each raid was covered by deep Mustang escort. And just as planned, the Luftwaffe rose to defend. What happened next was not a duel. It was systematic destruction. German pilots, many fresh from training schools after months of attrition, took off with minimal flight hours. They climbed to intercept, and were attacked before they could even reach formation altitude. Veterans tried to reorganize, but the Mustang free hunters cut their reinforcement lines, shooting down stragglers and crippling squadron cohesion. In just 1 week, the Luftwaffe lost over 500 aircraft and, far more devastatingly, nearly 100 of its irreplaceable veteran pilots. Factories could produce planes. Germany could no longer produce experience. The German command realizes the truth. Luftwaffe High Command reviewed combat reports from Big Week in Berlin. What they found was alarming. Their intercept formations were no longer engaging bombers effectively because the Mustangs were intercepting the interceptors. This was a new dimension of warfare, strategic fighter dominance. One German squadron leader wrote in his after-action report, "We rose to attack the bombers, but they did not fear us. Their fighters did not escort, they stalked. The sky belonged to them." Luftwaffe Command, once dismissive of the American strategy as wasteful, now issued emergency directives. Avoid direct engagement with long-range American escorts unless tactical advantage is guaranteed. In other words, do not fight unless you can win. But there was no longer a way to win. Mustangs at the runways, no safe haven by mid-1944. The Luftwaffe's nightmare escalated further. Mustang squadrons began extending their patrol patterns beyond the bombing corridors. They flew towards enemy airfields waiting for German aircraft to land low on fuel. As fighters lined up for landing, Mustangs dove at high speed, strafing runways, destroying parked aircraft, fuel depots, and maintenance hangars. This was unheard of early in the war. The Luftwaffe was not used to being hunted on the ground. German ground crews described the eerie sound of the P-51's engine approaching during landing operations. "We heard the whistle before we saw them. Then fire, always fire." A shift in radio silence. Bomber crews, once tense and fatalistic, noticed a change in morale. Radio chatter evolved. Early in the war, a bomber crew's greatest fear was hearing, "Fighters inbound, no escort." A death sentence. Now, over German territory, the callouts were different. Mustangs still with us. Stay tight. Keep formation. We are covered. This shift in mindset was more powerful than armor plating or gun turrets. It was psychological air superiority. For the first time, American bomber crews believed they could reach their targets and return. The moment the Luftwaffe could not replace on paper, the Luftwaffe continued to field hundreds of fighters through 1944. Factories still produced Bf-109s and Fw-190s. But inside German command reports, a different truth was acknowledged. Aircraft we can build. Pilots we cannot. Pilot training hours had dropped from over 250 hours in 1940 to less than 110 hours by mid-1944. Replacement. Pilots were sent into combat with just a fraction of flight experience. Many never returned. From their first engagement, the Luftwaffe was now a force of machines without masters, and the Mustangs ensured every mistake was fatal. By late summer 1944, something strange happened in the skies above Germany. Silence. Bombing formations that once braced for impact over the Rhine and Ruhr now reported long stretches with no enemy fighters in sight. Instead of frantic evasive maneuvers, bomber crews watched the contrails of P-51 formations gliding with them. Calm, unchallenged, sovereign. This was not because Germany had run out of aircraft entirely. Luftwaffe air bases still held fighters. Aircraft factories, though bombed repeatedly, were still producing frames. But the German command, now painfully aware of the cost of every sortie, had adopted a new survival directive. Preserve aircraft for homeland defense only. Avoid interception unless target is of highest strategic priority. The Luftwaffe was no longer an offensive force. It had become a reactive, cornered guardian, striking only when absolutely necessary, and even then, often too late. The strategic impact. American bombers became a war machine of certainty before P-51 escorts. Every mission carried a silent, grim calculation. Will we make it back? Losses of 8 to 10% per raid meant bomber groups could be wiped out in just a few missions. Escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt had range limitations. They could only accompany bombers partway before turning back. But with the Mustang, range exceeding 1,600 kilometers with drop tanks, bomber crews now flew under continuous protection, from England to Berlin and back. Loss rates dropped below 2%. This wasn't just a tactical improvement. It was industrial warfare gaining unstoppable momentum. Fewer bomber losses meant more experienced crews survived. Increasing mission efficiency, target accuracy improved. As bombers no longer needed to break formation under attack, repeat raids became possible, hitting the same target weeks apart until total destruction was ensured. German industry had no time to recover, no pause to rebuild. The United States had achieved what many pre-war strategists considered impossible: sustained, precise strategic bombing deep into enemy territory without air superiority being contested. The German industrial heartland begins to collapse. Cities like Leipzig, Schweinfurt, and Essen, once protected by layers of flak batteries and fighter interceptors, now lay exposed. American bombers switched from single devastating blows to systematic grinding. Campaign's ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt were hit 4 times in 2 months. Synthetic fuel refineries, the lifeblood of the Panzer divisions, were bombed until output dropped by over 70%. Railway junctions critical for Eastern Front logistics were reduced to twisted metal. Without fuel, German tanks could not move. Without ball bearings, artillery and aircraft production slowed to a crawl. The P-51 was not just destroying planes, it was disabling the arteries of an entire war machine. Luftwaffe aces, legends falling. One by one, Germany still had elite pilots, names spoken with reverence among Allied air commanders. Adolf Galland, Walter Nowotny, Johannes Steinhoff, but these were exceptions. For every surviving ace, dozens of inexperienced pilots were thrown into battle with minimal training. Mustang pilots quickly learned to identify such novices by their flight patterns: late climbs, slow turns, hesitation before engaging. They were easy prey. Pilots like Chuck Yeager, Bud Anderson, and George Preddy, now legends themselves, would later describe the grim efficiency of those engagements. It was not a duel. It was a job. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft. It still had runways. But it no longer had time, and time was the one strategic resource America had in abundance. From this point onward, the air war was decided. German command knew it. American crews could feel it. And the ground war, still raging in Normandy, Italy, and the Eastern Front, was about to feel the consequences of a silent Luftwaffe. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe still existed on paper. Reports listed fighter groups, airfields, fuel allocations, and squadron numbers. But the sky told a different truth, a truth bomber crews described as unsettling. Germany's once feared fighters were simply not there anymore. What had begun as a duel for dominance ended as a one-sided occupation of the air. Ground forces. Notice the change when American forces advanced through Normandy, then into France and Belgium. They expected fierce Luftwaffe resistance. Instead, field reports from U.S. infantry divisions repeatedly described the same phenomenon: Mustangs overhead. No enemy aircraft sighted. This was more than relief. It changed how ground combat was fought. Tank columns moved without fear of air ambush. Supply convoys rolled in daylight. Something unimaginable in North Africa or Italy just a year before. Forward observers requested airstrikes freely, knowing friendly air cover was guaranteed. To German infantry and panzer crews, the constant drone of P-51 engines brought a new kind of fear. Not of death from above, but of helplessness. Looking up brought no reassurance, no silhouette of friendly wings, only the sharp outline of a single-seat American fighter gliding with predatory calm. Fuel. The invisible victim of the Mustang strategists often refer to fuel shortages as the final break in German military capability. But what caused those shortages was not just refinery bombings. It was the P-51's ability to make every supply route, every repair effort, every fuel convoy a potential target. Synthetic fuel plants in Leuna, Ludwigshafen, and Politz were hit repeatedly. Train convoys carrying refined fuel were strafed by Mustang roving hunter groups. Repair crews working on damaged facilities reported P-51 patrols circling for hours, waiting for any sign of movement to open fire. The result? German armored divisions received just 10–20% of their required fuel supply by late 1944. Tigers and Panthers, engineering marvels on paper, became static bunkers abandoned on roadsides because they could not move. The Mustang was not just an escort fighter anymore, it had become the aerial embargo of an entire nation. Psychological. Warfare in the skies. German pilots who survived early war engagements recalled a time when they hunted bombers with confidence, diving through defensive fire to claim victories. But in 1944, a new tone filled Luftwaffe logs: avoidance, caution, resignation. Enemy fighters dominate every altitude. Interception is impossible without loss. Recommend holding position. Luftwaffe Squadron Dispatch. October 1944. This was not the language of a fighting air force. This was the language of acceptance. American bomber crews described it in equally stark terms. There was a time when we braced for fighters. Now hours pass in formation, and not a single German wing appears. The absence of an enemy became more powerful than their presence had ever been. Berlin, January 1945. The final symbol in one of the last large-scale bombing raids over Berlin. Over 400 American bombers crossed German airspace with nearly 900 escort fighters, the majority of them Mustangs. Only a handful of German fighters rose to challenge them. They were shot down in minutes. The raid continued uninterrupted. Berlin burned under waves of bombs, and not a single bomber group reported sustained Luftwaffe engagement. The sky over the German capital, once the heart of European air doctrine, was firmly American territory. And from that moment on, every German soldier on the ground knew the air war was over. There would be no Luftwaffe coming to stop the advance. No roar of friendly engines. Only silence, followed by the distant growl of P-51s. The skies were decided. The factories were burning. The Luftwaffe was finished. What remained was understanding what this shift meant for the course of the entire war, and for the future of air power itself. In the final months of the war, the outcome on the ground was clear, but it had been decided long before Allied tanks crossed the Rhine. The moment P-51 Mustangs claimed the skies, Germany lost the ability to fight a modern war. The Luftwaffe had once been the pride of Europe, a symbol of precision, speed, and tactical genius. Its early victories in Poland, France, and the Mediterranean had shaped global air doctrine. But by 1944, that legacy had been erased by a single principle America executed with relentless clarity. Air power is not won by bravery alone. It is won by range, endurance, and industrial persistence. The P-51 was not just a fighter. It was a declaration of strategic will, a machine designed not just to kill enemy aircraft but to occupy airspace, deny mobility, and erase the enemy's ability to choose when and where to fight. Once, German pilots laughed at American bomber strategy, calling it crude, clumsy, naive. By war's end, no one was laughing. The Mustangs flew in quiet formation over a defeated air force, their presence a reminder of a transformation in warfare. Victory would belong not to the pilot who fought the hardest, but to the nation that could stay in the sky the longest. From that point forward, every modern air force would study the lesson written in contrails over Germany. He who controls the air does not just win battles, he prevents the enemy from fighting at all. And high above the ruined factories, the shattered runways and the silent Luftwaffe hangars, the Mustang kept flying, not as a weapon of war anymore, but as a symbol that the age of American air dominance had begun.